An Acceptable Time by Madeleine L'Engle, Chapter 2. The whole incident made no sense whatsoever. Polly put on her robe and headed for the kitchen, looking for explanations, but saw no one. Probably everybody was out in the lab, where it was definitely too chilly for a swamp blossom in a wet bathing suit and damp terry cloth robe. Her parents had worried she might be lonely with no people her own age around, and in one day she had seen three: the blue-eyed young man by the oak, though he was probably several years older than she, Zachary, and now this unknown girl. Upstairs in her room, the stripy cat was lying curled in the center of the bed, one of his favorite places. She picked him up and held him, and he purred, pleased with her damp warmth. "Who on earth was that girl?" she demanded. "And what was she talking about?" She squeezed the cat too tightly, and he jumped from her arms and stalked out of the room, brown and amber tail erect. She dressed and went downstairs. The bishop was in the kitchen, sitting in one of the shabby but comfortable chairs by the fireplace. She joined him. "What's the matter?" he asked. "I'm just puzzled. While I was swimming, there was a knock on one of the windows, and I got out of the pool to look, and there was this girl about my age with long black hair and sort of exotic eyes, and I let her in, and she made absolutely no sense at all." "Go on." The bishop was alert, totally focused on her words. "This afternoon, by the grandfather oak, you know the tree I mean?" "Yes." "I saw a young man and a dog. The girl said the man with the dog had seen me, and then something about circles of time, and then she heard a noise and got frightened and ran away. Who do you suppose she was?" The bishop looked at Polly without answering, simply staring at her with a strange, almost shocked look on his face. "Bishop? Well, my dear," he cleared his throat. "Yes, it is indeed strange. Strange indeed. Should I tell my grandparents?" He hesitated, cleared his throat. "Probably." She nodded. She trusted him. He hadn't had a cushy job as a bishop. Her grandparents had told her he'd been in the Amazon for years, taught seminary in China, had a price on his head in Peru. When he was with so-called primitive people, he listened to them rather than imposing his own views. He honored others. She was so concerned with her own story that she was not aware that what she had told him had upset him. "Polly," he said, "tell me about the young man with the dog." His voice trembled slightly. "He was standing by the grandfather oak. He had these intense blue eyes." "What was the dog like?" "Just a big dog with large eyes. Not any particular breed. I didn't see them for more than a few seconds." "And the girl, can you describe her?" "Well, not much more than I just did. Long black hair braid and dark eyes. She was beautiful and strange." "Yes," the bishop said. "Oh, yes." His voice was soft and troubled. Now she saw that something had disturbed him. "Do you know who she is?" "Perhaps. How can I be sure?" He paused and spoke briskly. "Yes, it's strange, strange indeed. Your grandfather is right to discourage trespassers." His eyes were suddenly veiled. Mr. Murray came in from the pantry, heard the bishop's last words. "Right, Nays, I'm quite happy to have deer and foxes leaping over the stone walls, but not snoopers. We've had to put a horrendously expensive warning system in the lab. Louise is correct. Most of Kate's equipment hasn't been used in decades, but the computers are another story." He headed for the wood stove, turned to Polly. "The lab has been broken into twice. Once a useless microscope was taken, and once your grandmother lost a week's work because someone, probably local kids rather than anyone who knew anything about her work, played around with the computer." He opened the small oven of the wood stove, and the odor of freshly baked bread filled the kitchen. "Bread is something Kate can't make on the Bunsen burner, so this is my contribution, as well as therapy. Kneading bread is wonderful for rheumatic fingers." Mrs. Murray and Dr. Louise followed him into the kitchen. Mrs. Murray lit candles in addition to the oil lamps and turned out the lights. Dr. Louise put a large casserole of Mrs. Murray's chicken concoction on the table, and Mr. Murray took a bowl of autumn vegetables from the stove: broccoli, cauliflower, sprouts, onions, carrots, leeks. The bishop sniffed appreciatively. Mrs. Murray said, "The twins used to have a vast vegetable garden. Ours isn't nearly as impressive, but Alex does amazingly well." "For an old man, you mean," Mr. Murray said. Except for your arthritis," Dr. Louise said, "you're in remarkably good shape. I wish some of my patients 10 years or more younger than you did as well." After they were seated, and the meal blessed and served, Polly looked at the bishop. His eyes met hers briefly. Then he glanced away, and his expression was withdrawn. But she thought he had barely perceptibly nodded at her. She said, "I've seen a couple of odd people today." "Who?" her grandfather asked. "You're not talking about Zachary," Dr. Louise laughed. She shook her head and described both the young man with the dog and the girl. "Zachary thought he was a caretaker, maybe." The bishop choked slightly, got up, and poured himself some water. Recovering himself, he asked, "You say that Zachary saw this young man?" "Sure, he was right there, but he didn't talk to either of us." "I hope he wasn't a hunter," Mr. Murray said. "Our land is very visibly posted." "He didn't have a gun, I'm positive. Is it hunting season here or something?" "It's never hunting season on our land," her grandfather said. "Did you speak to him, ask him what he was doing?" "I didn't get a chance. I just saw him looking at me, and when I got to the tree, he was gone." "What about the girl?" Mrs. Murray probed. Polly looked at the bishop. His eyes were once again veiled, his expression non-committal. Polly repeated her description of the girl. "I really don't think they were poachers or vandals or anything bad. They were just mysterious." Her grandfather's voice was unexpectedly harsh. "I don't want any more mysteries." The bishop was staring at the Ogham stone sitting on the kitchen dresser, along with assorted mugs, bowls, a gravy boat, a hammer, a roll of stamps. Mrs. Murray's voice was light. "Perhaps they'll be friends for Polly?" "The girl's about my age, I think," Polly said. "She had gorgeous soft leather clothes that would cost a fortune in a boutique, and she wore a sort of silver collar with a beautiful stone." Mrs. Murray laughed. "Your mother said you were finally showing some interest in clothes. I'm glad to note evidence of it." Polly was slightly defensive. "There hasn't been any reason for me to wear anything but jeans." "Silver collar," the bishop spoke as though to himself. "A talk." He was busily helping himself to vegetables. Mrs. Murray had heard. "A torque?" She turned to Polly. "Nason has a book on early metalwork with beautiful photographs. The early Druids may have lived among Stone Age people, but there were metal workers at least passing through Britain, and the Druids were already sophisticated astronomers. They and the tribal leaders wore intricately designed torques." "The wheel of fashion keeps coming full circle," Dr. Louise said. "And how much have we learned since the Stone Age as far as living peaceably is concerned?" Mr. Murray regarded his wife. "There's a picture of a superb silver torque in Nason's book that I wish I could get for you, Kate. It would eminently suit you." Polly looked at her grandmother's sensible country clothes and tried to visualize her in a beautiful torque. It was not impossible. She had been told that her grandmother was a beauty, and she looked at the older woman's fine bones, the short, well-cut silver hair, the graceful curve of the slender neck, the fine eyes surrounded by lines made from smiles and pain and generous living. She thought that her grandmother was still beautiful, and she was glad that her grandfather's response was to want to get his wife a torque. Mrs. Murray had taken a blueberry pie from the freezer for dessert and brought it bubbling from the oven. "I didn't make it," she explained. "There's a blueberry festival at church every summer, and I always buy half a dozen unbaked pies to have on hand." She cut into it, and purple juice streamed out with summer fragrance. "Polly, I can't tell you how pleased I am that your Zachary turned up. It must have been hard for you to leave your friends." Polly accepted a slice of pie. "Island kids tend to be isolated. My friends are sort of scattered. I've been lucky to have Louise living only a few miles away. We've been friends ever since college." Yes, her grandmother was lucky to have Dr. Louise, Polly thought. She had never had a real female friend her own age. She thought fleetingly of the girl at the pool. Polly and the bishop did the dishes together, and the others went to sit by the fire in the living room, urged on by Mrs. Murray, who said they all spent too much time in the kitchen. "So, Island girl," the bishop said, "is all well here?" "Very well, thank you, Bishop." She wanted to ask him more about the man with the dog and the girl at the pool, but it was clear to her that the bishop was guiding the conversation away from them. She took a rinsed plate from him and put it in the dishwasher. My sister has taught me to wash everything with soap, even if it's going in the dishwasher. Be careful, the plates are slippery." "Okay." "Your young man." Zachary Gray. He didn't look well. He's always pale. Last summer in Greece, when everybody was tan, Zachary's skin was white. Of course, I don't think he goes out in the sun much. He isn't the athletic type." "How was last summer?" The bishop wrung out a sponge. Polly was putting silverware in the dishwasher basket. It was a wonderful experience. I loved Athens, and the conference in Cyprus was worth a year at school. Maximiliana Horn, arranged it all, and she died just before I got home. He nodded. Your grandparents told me you're still grieving. She dried the knives, which were old silver ones with the handles glued on and could not be put in the dishwasher. It was harder at home, where everything reminded me of Max. Did you know her? The bishop let the soapy water out of the sink. Your Uncle Sandy told me about her. They were great friends. Yes, Sandy introduced me to her. Unexpectedly, her throat tightened. The bishop led the way to one of the shabby chairs by the kitchen fireplace, rather than joining the others in the living room. Polly followed him, and as she sat down, Hadron appeared and jumped onto her lap, purring, Bishop, about the young man and the girl. But at that moment, Dr. Louise came into the kitchen, yawning. Dishes all done. And with soap, the bishop assured her. Time for us to be getting on home. Polly and her grandparents went outside to wave the calubras off. And the stars were brilliant amid small wisps of cloud. The moon was tangled in the branches of a large Norway maple. The bishop climbed into the driver's seat of the blue pickup truck, and they took off with a squeal of tires. Polly's grandmother turned to go back into the house. We're going for a quick swim. I'll come and say good night in a while. It had already been a comfortable habit that after Polly went to bed, her grandmother would come in and talk for a few minutes. She took a hurried bath. The bathroom was frigid, and slipped into a flannel nightgown. Then into bed, pulling the quilt about her, she read a few pages of the book her grandfather had given her, on white holes, cosmic gushers, the opposite of black holes. Her grandparents were certainly seeing to her education, but perhaps it was no wonder that her grandfather had not noticed stones in his walls that had strange markings. When her grandmother came in, she put the book down on the nightstand, and Mrs. Murray sat on the side of the bed. Lovely evening. It's good that Naves is living with Louise. Your grandfather and I feel as though we've known him forever. He was a fine bishop. He's tender and compassionate, and he knows how to listen. Polly pushed up higher against the pillows. Yes, I feel I could tell him anything, and he wouldn't be shocked. And he'd never betray a confidence. Grand. Polly sat up straight. Something's been bothering me. What, my dear? I sort of just got dumped on you, didn't I? Oh, Polly, your grandfather and I have enough sense of self-protection so that we haven't wanted you to come, so that if we hadn't wanted you to come, we'd have said no. We felt very deprived, seeing so little of our grandchildren. We love having you. It's a very different life from what you've been used to. Oh, Grand, I love it. I'm happy here. Grand, why did Mother have so many kids? Would you want any of you not to have been born? No, but it doesn't answer your question. Mrs. Murray pushed her fingers through her still damp hair. If a woman is free to choose a career, she's also free to choose the care of a family as her primary vocation. Was it that with Mother? Partly, her grandmother sighed, but it was probably partly because of me. You? Why? I'm a scientist, Polly, and well known in my field. Well, but Mother... She stopped. You mean maybe she didn't want to compete with you? That could be part of it. You mean she was afraid she couldn't compete? Your mother's estimation of herself has always been low. Your father has been wonderful for her, and so, in many ways, have you children. But, her voice drifted off, but you did your work and had kids. Not 7 of them. Her grandmother's hands were tightly clasped together. Then deliberately she relaxed them, placed them over her knees. Polly slid down in the bed to a more comfortable position. Suddenly she felt drowsy. Hadron, who had taken to sleeping with Polly, curled in the curve between shoulders and neck, began to purr. Women have come a long way, her grandmother said, but there will always be problems and glories that are unique to women. The cat's purr rose contentedly. Hadron certainly seems to have taken to you. A hadron, Polly murmured sleepily, belongs to a class of particles that interact strongly. Nucleons are hadrons, and so are pions and strange particles. Good girl, Mrs. Murray said. You're a quick learner. Strange particles. Polly's eyes closed. You'd think human beings would be full of strange particles. Maybe we are. Hadrons are, I think, formed of quarks, so the degree of strangeness in a hadron is calculated by the number of quarks. Were druids strange? She was more than half asleep. I don't know much about druids. Polly's breathing slowed, and she pushed her face into the pillow, close to Hadron's warm fur. Mrs. Murray rose, stood for a moment, looking at her granddaughter, then slipped out of the room. In the morning, Polly woke early, dressed, and went downstairs. No one was stirring. The ground was white with mist, which drifted across the lawn. The mountains were slowly emerging on the horizon, and above them the sky shimmered between the soft gray of dawn and the blue, which would clarify as the sun rose. She headed outdoors across the field, which was as wet with dew as though it had rained during the night. At the stone wall she paused, but it was probably too early for Louise the larger. Polly continued along the path toward the star-watching rock. She had pulled on the old red anorak, and she wore lined jeans, so she was warm enough. She looked up at the sky in surprise, as there was a sudden strange shimmering in the air. Then there was a flash, as though from lightning, but no thunder. The ground quivered slightly under her feet, then settled. Was it an earthquake? She looked around. The trees were different, larger. There were many more oaks, towering even higher than the grandfather oak. As she neared the star-watching rock, she saw light flashing on water, and where the fertile valley had been, there was now a large lake. A lake? She reeled in surprise. Where had a lake come from? And the hills were no longer the gentle hills worn down by wind and rain and erosion, but jagged mountains, their peaks capped with snow. She turned, her flesh prickling, and looked at the rock. And it was the same star-watching rock she had always loved. And yet it was not the same. "What's going on?" she asked aloud. Wreaths of mist were dissipating to reveal a dozen or more tents made of stretched and curved and cured animal skins. Beyond them was an enormous vegetable garden and a field of corn, the stalks recently cut and gathered into bunches. Beyond the cornfield, cows and sheep were grazing. On lines strung between poles, fish were hanging. Between stronger poles, beaver skins were being dried and stretched. In front of one of the tents, a woman was sitting, pounding something with a mortar and pestle. She had black hair worn in a braid, and she was singing as she worked, paying no attention to Polly or anything going on around her. Absorbed in the rhythm of the pestle and her song, she looked like a much older version of the girl who had come to the pool. In the distance, Polly heard the sound of a drum, and then singing, a beautiful melody with rich native harmony. The rising sun seemed to be pulled up out of the sky by the beauty of the song. When the music ended, there was a brief silence, and then the noises of the day resumed. What on earth was happening? Where was she? How could she get home? She turned in the direction where the Murray house should have been, and coming toward her was a group of young men carrying spears. Instinctively, Polly ran behind one of the great oak trees and peered out from behind the wide trunk. Two of the men had a young deer slung onto their spears. They continued past her, beyond the tents and the garden and the cornfield and the pasture. They wore soft leather leggings and tunics, similar to the clothes worn by the girl who had come to Polly at the pool. After they were out of sight on the path, she leaned against the tree because her legs felt like water. What was happening? Where had the huge forest behind her come from? What about the lake, which took up the entire valley? Who were the young men? Her mind was racing, reaching out in every direction, trying to make some kind of sense out of this total dislocation. Certainly life had proven to her more than once that the world is not a reasonable place, but this was unreason beyond unreason. Up the path came a young man with hair bleached almost white. He carried a spear, far larger than those of the hunters. At the haft it was balanced by what looked like a copper ball about the size of an apple or an orange, and just below this was a circle of feathers. She hid behind the tree so that he would not see her, dressed in jeans and a red anorak. In one of the great oaks, a cardinal was singing sweetly, a familiar sound. A small breeze blew through the bleached autumn grasses, ruffled the waters of the lake. The air was clear and pure. The mountains hunched great rugged shoulders into the blue of the sky, and early sunlight sparkled off the white peaks. She drew in her breath. Coming along the path toward her was the girl she had seen at the pool, her black braid swinging. She carried an armful of autumn flowers, deep blue Michaelmas daisies. White Queen Anne's lace, yellow golden glow. She walked to a rock Polly had not noticed before, a flat gray rock resting on two smaller rocks, somewhat like a pi sign in stone. The girl placed her flowers on the rock, looked up at the sky, and lifted her voice in song. Her voice was clear and sweet, and she sang as simply and spontaneously as a bird. When she was through, she raised her arms heavenward, a radiance illuminating her face. Then she turned, as though sensing Polly's presence behind the tree. Polly came out. "Hi!" The girl's face drained of color, and she swirled as though to run off. "Hey, wait!" Polly called. Slowly, the girl walked toward the star-watching rock. "Who are you?" Polly asked. "Anaral." The girl pointed to herself as she said her name. She had on the same soft leather tunic and leggings she had worn the night before, and at her throat was the silver band with the pale stone in the center. The forefinger of her right hand was held out a little stiffly, and on it was a band-aid, somehow utterly incongruous. "What were you singing? It was beautiful. You have an absolutely gorgeous voice." With each word, Polly was urging the girl not to run away again. A faint touch of peach colored Anaral's cheeks, and she bowed her head. "What is it? Can you tell me the words?" The color deepened slightly. Anaral, for the first time, looked directly at Polly. "The good morning song to our mother, who gives us the earth on which we live." She paused as though seeking for words. "Teaches us to listen to the wind, to care for all that she gives us, food to grow." Another thinking pause. "The animals to nurture and ourselves. We ask her to help us, to know ourselves, that we may know each other, and to forgive." She rubbed her forehead. "To forgive ourselves when we do wrong, so that we may forgive each other, to help us walk the path of love, and to protect us from all that would hurt us." As Anaral spoke, putting her words slowly into English, her voice automatically moved into singing. "Thank you," Polly said. "We sing a lot in my family. They'd love that. I'd like to learn it." "I will teach you," Anaral smiled shyly. "Why did you run off last night?" Polly asked. "I was confused. It is not often that circles of time overlap. That you should be here. Oh, it is strange." "What is?" "That we should be able to see each other, to speak." Yes, Polly thought, strange indeed. Was it possible that she and Anaral were speaking across 3,000 years? "You do not belong to my people," Anaral said. "You are in a different spiral." "Who are your people?" Anaral stood proudly. "We are the people of the wind." "Are you Indians?" Polly asked. It seemed a rude question, but she wanted to know the answer. Anaral looked baffled. "I do not know that word. We have always been on this land. I was born to be trained as—" "You might understand if I said I was a druid." "A Native American who was a druid? But druids came from Britain." Anaral smiled. "Druid is not a word of the people of the wind." "Karalis, you saw him yesterday by the great oak." "Karalis brought the word with him from across the great water. You understand?" "Well, I'm not sure." "That is all right. I have told you my name, my druid name, that Karalis gave me. Anaral, and you are Polly O'Keefe." "How do you know my language?" "Bishop." "Bishop Kalubra?" Anaral nodded. "He taught you." Now Polly understood why the bishop had been concerned when she talked to him about Anaral and Karalis. And it was apparent that he had not told her grandparents or her sister everything he knew about the Ogham stones and the people who walked the land 3,000 years ago. "Yes, Bishop taught me." "How do you know him?" Anaral held out her hands. "He came to us." "How?" "Sometimes." Anaral swung her black braid over her shoulder. "It is possible to move from one ring to another." Polly had a vision of a picture of an early model of a molecule with its nucleus in the center and the atoms in shells or circles around it. Sometimes an electron jumped from one shell or circle to another, but this picture of the movement of electrons from circle to circle in a molecule didn't help much, because Anaral's circles were in time rather than space. Except, Polly reminded herself, time and space are not separable. "You came to my time yesterday," she said. "How did you do it?" Anaral put slim hands to her face. then took them down and looked at Polly. Keralis and I are druids. For us, the edges of time are soft, not hard. We can move through it like water. Are you a druid? No, Polly was definite, but it seems that I am now in your time. I am in my time, Anarol said. But if you are, I must be. Our circles are touching. Druids know about astronomy. Do you know about time? Anarol laughed. There are more circles of time than anyone can count, and we understand a few of them, but only a few. I have the old knowledge, the knowledge of the people of the wind, and now Keralis is teaching me his new knowledge, the druidic knowledge. Does the bishop know all of this? Oh yes, do you belong to the bishop? To friends of his? You belong to the scientists. I'm their granddaughter. The one with the crooked fingers and the lame knees. Bishop tells me he knows something about time. Yes, more than most people, but not about going back 3,000 years, which is what I've done, isn't it? Anarol shook her head. 3,000 years? I do not know what 3,000 years means. You have stepped across the threshold. I don't know how I did it, Polly said. I just set out to walk to the star-watching rock, and suddenly I was here. Do you know how I can get back? Anarol smiled a little sadly. I am not always sure myself how it happens. The circles overlap and a threshold opens, and then we can cross over. As Anarol gestured with her hands, Polly noticed again the band-aid anachronistically on Anarol's finger. What did you do to your finger? I cut myself with a hunting knife. I was skinning a deer and the knife slipped. How did you get that band-aid? You don't have band-aids in your own time, do you? Anarol shook her head. Dr. Louise sewed my finger up for me, many stitches. That was more than a moon ago. It is nearly well now, when I could take off the big bandage. Bishop brought me this. She held up the finger with the band-aid. How did you get to Dr. Louise? Bishop brought me to her. How? Bishop saw me right after the knife slipped. The cut was deep. Oh, very deep. I bled. I was scared, crying. Bishop held my fingers, pressing to stop the blood spurting. Then he said, come, and we ran. Bishop can really run, and suddenly we were in Dr. Louise's office. You don't have anybody in your own time who could have taken care of the cut for you? The ancient gray wolf could have. He was our healer for many years, but he died during the cold of last winter, and his son, who should have followed him, died when the winter fever swept through our people a few turns of the sun ago. Cub, the young wolf, who will become our healer, still has much to learn. Keralis, of course, could have helped me, but he was away that day with the young men hunting. Keralis is a druid from Britain, from far. Keralis is who came in the strange boat, 3 turns of the sun back, blown across the lake by a hurricane of fierce winds. He came as we people of the wind were mourning the death of our great one, felled by an oak tree uprooted in the storm, picked up like a twig and flung down, the life crushed out of him. He was very old and had foretold that he would not live another sun turn. And out of the storm Keralis came, and with him another from the sea, Tav, who is almost white of hair and has skin that gets red if he stays out in the sun. Tav, that must be the young man with the spear. Where did they come from, Keralis and Tav? From the great waters, beyond the rivers and the mountains, and lo, at the very moment that Keralis's boat touched the shore, the wind dropped and the storm ended and a great rainbow arched across the lake, and we knew that the maker of the stars had sent us a new great one. And Tav? Polly asked. Anarol continued. Tav was in the canoe half dead with fever. Even with all their skill, Keralis and Grey Wolf had a hard time bringing the fever down. Night after night they stayed with Tav, praying. Cub, the young wolf, was beside him, watching, learning. The fever went down with the moon, and Tav's breathing was suddenly gentle as a child's, and he slept, and he was well. They are a great gift to us, Keralis and Tav. Is Tav a druid? Oh, no. He is a warrior. He is our greatest hunter. We have not had to worry about having enough meat since Tav came. Polly frowned, trying to sort things out. You were born here, in this place. Yes, but you're a druid, Anarol laughed. Now that I am what I am called now. For this I was born, and Keralis has trained me in his wisdom, and now there is danger to our people. And Keralis thinks you have been brought across the threshold to help us. But how could I possibly? Polly started. There was a sharp sound as if someone stepping on and breaking a twig, and Anarol was off, swift as a deer. Polly looked around, but saw no one. You have been brought across the threshold to help us, Anarol had said. What on earth did she mean, and how was Polly to get back across the threshold to her own time? Without Anarol, how could she possibly get home? She ran after the other girl. Polly had long legs, and she ran quickly, but she was not familiar with the path, which zigzagged back and forth, always downhill. Anarol was nowhere to be seen. Polly continued on, past the village, around the garden and the cornfield, across the pasture, and then picked up a path which led through a grove of birch and beech trees. She followed it until it opened out at a large flat stone, not quite as large as the star-watching rock, but in this terrain, which had been covered by glaciers and topsoil, was thin, the bones of the earth close to the surface. She continued on, listening, as she heard water plashing. Then she was standing on a stone bridge under which a small brook ran. She had been here before during her exploring, and it was a lovely place. Trees leaned over the water, dropping golden leaves. She was surrounded by rich October smells, decomposing apple leaves, hickory nuts, acorns, pine cones, all sending their nourishment into the earth, and suddenly she realized that the trees were the trees of her own time, not those of a primeval forest. She was home. And that is the end of chapter 2.